Hello, and thank you for joining us for this edition of ICTV in Studio. I'm your host, Paige Hopkins, joined by Greg Barnes, and today we're going to talk about some Carolina football and kind of analyze the scrimmage that they just had on Saturday. So Greg, this is the second scrimmage of the spring season. How, just as a whole in general, do you see the team progressing from now to where they were at the end of last football season?
Well, I think they've made leaps and bounds just in terms of building depth. And I think more than anything with this team, where they needed to improve so much from last year was attitude, chemistry, all those things. And I think that's the primary takeaway. If you look at what this team really did through the first 9 practices leading up to that scrimmage on Saturday. A lot more liveliness on the sidelines. The guys are excited. It helps having a brand new defensive staff in. Larry Fedora seems more relaxed. So I think from that standpoint, it sets the foundation kind of to build off of last season, which is desperately what they needed. But in terms of the play itself, they've got better depth at certain positions. It doesn't help that they've had a lot of injuries, on the defensive line in particular, and at wide receiver. They were missing most of their starting wide receivers on Saturday. But beyond that, I think there's been a lot of positives. And we always say that in springtime. Very rarely do you have a bad spring practice because
right.
Hope Springs eternal in April and March. But I think for what they needed to have accomplished, they've done that thus far.
Got it. And I definitely agree with what you said about player attitudes, because even the offensive guys have been so excited about the new defensive staff, and I think everyone's really fired up on this team. But also, like you said, this is just the spring season, so how much weight should we be putting on play we see right now in practices and scrimmages? I mean, how much can we really rely on what we're seeing now?
Well, I think with the scrimmage on Saturday in particular, you've got an offense that pretty much returns all the pieces. I mentioned some of those injuries at the wide receiver. So you expect them to make significant strides. And you saw some good play on Saturday, not having Marquise Williams clearly hurt, but with a guy like Mitch Trubisky, who really battled Marquise last year, came in, played very well. He's really taken more command of the offense, and he's done a pretty good job. And I think particularly offensive line was an issue last year. And you saw them make some good plays on Saturday. Really in both of the scrimmages they've had thus far, the offensive line has looked pretty good. You like to see a kid like Bentley Spain move up. You want to see that talent kind of take hold, and that gives you an extra body at tackle. You know what Ferranto can do, so now you've got Spain. On the defensive side of the ball, though, it's a complete mixed bag because you do have a new coaching staff in, a lot of player movement, lost some key parts of that. And so from that vantage point, they're really starting from the ground up. And I think that's kind of the big thing is they looked good in their base packages, but as you saw in certain plays, the 2 Kendrick Singleton breakdowns, that was miscommunication. On those 2 plays, 2 guys blitz, and only one was supposed to blitz. And so what you have is a tight end left wide open, and it results in easy touchdowns. So the defense is very much at a base level right now. Mm-hmm. That's where Gene Chizik wants them. And so it's going to be a matter of building upon that foundation, and that's going to be a lot of work involved with that.
Got it. And you're leading into my question as well. So you talked about Mitch Trubisky a little bit. He looks good on the offensive side, leading the team and leading the offense. How much do you think the coaches will look at his performance in the spring season when it comes to maybe Marquise getting better and picking the starter later on?
Yeah, I think this is finally Marquise's team. That was a big talking point last spring and last summer. But Marquise did enough during the season. He was one of the best quarterbacks in the country, especially in the ACC. He's done enough to kind of grab that position. And so what you like to see now is if Mitch was 1B, now he gets the opportunity to get even better. Marquise is not going to lose his starting job in the spring, but maybe when training camp comes around and Marquise is back, that's going to allow Mitch to push him even more. And this is Marquise's job. I fully expect him to start next year. But having a guy like Mitch right behind him is never a bad thing. As we saw last year, for example, in the Virginia game where Mitch is able to come in and throw a game-winning touchdown pass.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And flip-flopping back to the defense now, you talked a little bit about some of the hardships the defense was facing during the scrimmage. Just touch on a little bit more about how much of this do you think maybe has to do with talent, and how much of it has to do with just learning this new system, going from the 4-2 to the 3-4?
That's a great point, and I think it's really a situation where you've got enough talent. I think the coaching staff believes they've got enough guys on the roster that they can field a productive defense. But as I mentioned, right now it's really starting at ground zero. I mean, that's where the coaching staff came in and said, look, we want to start from scratch. And talking with a player earlier in the week, he said the first couple of days of spring practice, he was learning things that he learned back in 5th grade. I mean, that's how basic they're going. It reminds me of back in '07 when Butch Davis's staff first came in. They had to teach the team how to huddle. And that's a very basic concept, but that's how Gene Chizik has kind of decided to move forward with this defense. And so talent, I don't think they're so concerned with it right now. I mean, you can only do so much with talent. You've got to use the guys that you have. Recruiting kind of fills that void. But they want to make sure that the guys they have know exactly what they need to be doing. And so that's why really Tuesday of this week was the first time they had installed the Tampa 2. And that's a big part of what this defense is going to be. But that kind of tells you how basic it was the first couple practices. I mean, you've got your base 4-3. You've got a nickel package, which you've got to use against Larry Fedora's spread offense. And then you've got a red zone defense. So that's what they've really been focused on. And so once you focus on that foundation of the defense, you can start adding more into it, which is what we'll see in the fall camp. And then from there, that's when talent starts to kind of shine through.
Got it. Kind of as a final wrap-up, Greg, what do you expect to see? Are there any major changes or kind of tweaks you'll think about seeing for the next scrimmage they have? I know they have one maybe in Charlotte a couple weeks coming up.
Right.
Any big changes you'll expect?
I don't think so. I think it's really a situation where what they're looking to see with this group of players is competition. They want to see toughness. One thing, for example, earlier in the week, that we saw at the practice when they had a scrimmage type situation between the defensive backs and the wide receivers. After some mistakes were made, after that drill period, Charlton Warren, the secondary coach, brought his guys over and had them do up-downs for every mistake that was made. And so that's what they're trying to beat in is we want to be competitive on every single play. We did not see that last year. That was a big issue with why this defense was as bad as it was. And so I think that's the mindset they're trying to instill. And if they can accomplish that by the end of spring practice, that will be a huge momentum boost, a huge move forward for this team. And that's really what they're focused on over the next week and a half before the end of spring practice.
Great. Yeah, I definitely think that kind of attitude, pushing hard on every play, is something that fans especially were so frustrated with last season. So we'll have to wait and see. Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
That's all for this edition of ICTV in Studio.